I've been going through the first few seasons of Dallas 1978, which focuses on the feud between the Ewing and Barnes families. Initially, it focuses on the marriage between Bobby Ewing and Pamela Barnes, and the ripple effect it has in their families. However, as episodes tick by, the scope of the conflict zooms out and focus is put onto other family members. We gain context on their histories with one another, and eventually a clearer picture on why there's such bad blood between them. But the feud is by no means stagnant. Family members continue to start shit, and chief among the shit starters is Bobby's older brother, JR, the biggest bastard of all time, forever. He's not only an abusive husband and a terrible family member, he breaks new ground by being a dubiously ethical businessman. Very refreshing for his field. His penchant for conflict is matched by Larry Hagman's ability to play him as a rich, smarmy asshole, and it gives Dallas its juice. One of the plotlines that drives the earlier seasons of the show is the affair between JR's wife, Sue Ellen, and Pamela's brother, Cliff. Sue Ellen, fed up with JR's treatment of her, attempts to break away from him, to mixed success. But it's fine. JR shows Sue Ellen that he cares about her mental health.
There's a clinic on the other side of Fort Worth. It's owned by a friend of mine.
Somehow I'll get back to you, JR!
This storyline continues into Season 3, where the business that JR inherited from his father would also become a point of greater interest. The stakes continue to increase through plotlines that last multiple episodes, and JR's progressively desperate deals start going south. Through JR, the Ewing Oil Company goes on to make very bitter enemies. Combined with his handling of the affair, JR's schemes are the most ghoulish thrill rides the show has on tap at this point. They're both infuriating because of their outward, almost cartoonish cruelty, and captivating to see what becomes of everyone and everything they affect. The back half of Season 3 is Dallas operating at peak soap opera, featuring increasingly wild drama and characters that are growing to genuinely despise one another. The Ewing and Barnes grandpas are forced to confront their differences. Cliff Barnes runs for Congress. Sue Ellen has someone's child. Bobby and Pamela's marriage begins to fall apart. Somebody digs up a skeleton with a bullet in its head. Kristen, Sue Ellen's sister, appears and causes her own wave of chaos. Sue Ellen herself is torn between 3 potential lives she could live. And most importantly, JR is a dick. Even to his mom.
I may never forgive you for this, JR.
He ruins Cliff's campaign, he threatens to kick Sue Ellen out, he attempts to run his own collaborators out of town, he and Kristen make Sue Ellen an alcoholic, then he also skips out on his promises to her, he does a little extremely ethical insider trading, which also turns out to be against his dad's wishes, and he even pushes Bobby and Pamela to move away from Dallas, which leaves the Ewing house divided. Everybody wanted to be JR's enemy.
I'll kill him.
And you start to wonder if any of these characters are going to act on their words.
Take a number.
Then a few scenes later, somebody does. And then the season ends. And when this episode aired in 1980, the Dallas viewer base collectively lost its fucking mind.
I want to see who shot JR.
I want to follow it and find out who shot JR.
I want to know who shot JR.
The sentence "who shot JR" became its own phenomenon. This wasn't the first time that Dallas had ended an episode on a cliffhanger, nor was it the first time JR had been shot. But this time the viewer base had the whole summer in between seasons to speculate on who did it. The culprit was not immediately obvious, and JR was an incredibly important character to Dallas's world, both emotionally and practically. Meaning the impact this would have on every character even moderately connected to him was immense. TV shows didn't really do this at the time, so this did gangbusters for viewer investment and became a pop cultural obsession. If you want to get a sense of how deep this went, here's a chart from Time magazine detailing the show's romantic relationships, business relationships, and possible suspects in JR's shooting. This was inescapable if you had even a passing interest in TV. Dallas was already super popular at this point, but this took it to the next level. There was a bunch of Who Shot JR merch. The sentence found its way into US politics. To keep the secret among the cast, they shot multiple versions of possible suspects being responsible. Hagman himself didn't even know who did it, which I'm sure made for a kind of awkward conversation with the Queen, who he also met because of this. Effectively, Who Shot JR worked both as a fandom question and as an advertisement, which was shown when the Season 4 premiere broke viewership records for the show. Then it happened again 3 episodes later when the shooter was actually revealed. It was a gambit that paid off tremendously, started a trend of season-ending cliffhangers in its own right, and is still remembered today as one of the defining moments in the canon of pop culture. I didn't watch Arcane until all of its episodes were available, but one of the things that stuck with me the most when it came out is how the show's episodes were released. The season was made up of 9 episodes, and 3 episodes were released in one batch per week over a 3-week run. It was released in thirds, basically. I thought the idea sounded kind of cool, but also a little unwieldy. It wasn't really a week-to-week release, and it wasn't just dumped onto Netflix at once either. You can even find articles from when Arcane was coming out that identify the release schedule as being a little out of the ordinary. That didn't stop Arcane from being more successful than honestly anyone probably expected it to be, and it's kind of hard for me to disagree with its popularity. Whether it's the unique, jaw-dropping presentation or the numerous compelling plot threads that slowly get entangled with one another, the show manages to thread the needle of being an animated sci-fi project with extremely wide appeal. You're unlikely to watch Arcane without having enjoyed at least one thing from it. But when you watch the show, you get the feeling as if the series was constructed in a way to try and accommodate its release schedule, which it only partially succeeds at, and I found that a little frustrating. Arcane is both this beautifully animated, consistently compelling show that received massive popularity and praise upon release, and is also an amalgamation of frustrating streaming age inconsistency that made me look at the entire enterprise sideways. Like, it has this awesome cliffhanger ending that's really easy to compare to Dallas's, but the way Arcane's lands is informed by how television as a medium has developed in the decades since, and I want to talk about it. This isn't a case of good cliffhanger, bad cliffhanger as much as it is me highlighting the circumstantial differences between two pieces of art that I really like, and think would make for an interesting discussion. As always, context is important, so let's go. Media scholar Emily Nussbaum has described cliffhangers as a climax cracked in half. More broadly, it's any strong dose of what happens next, the question that hovers in the black space between episodes. Well-implemented cliffhangers have been seen to create social buzzes around them, and the narrative device itself has been around for way longer than TV has existed. Nussbaum specifically brings up a time during the 19th century where fans of Charles Dickens' novel serials gathered at New York Harbor in anticipation for his next chapter, literally screaming at the boat shipping the magazines. People really wanted to know if a certain character had died. Spoiler alert, they did. So, a good cliffhanger can leave the audience with a healthy dose of anticipation, and if the story in question releases in mostly regular intervals, then excitement is maintained. For TV, the period of time between the airing of new episodes has been identified as a key portion of its appeal. Even if the cliffhanger is a fake-out, it speaks to the audience's willingness to anticipate what happens next, and waiting only a week between episodes can keep the investment going. Dallas is actually a really good case for this. It did this at the end of its season 4 premiere.
Who shot you, Mr. Ewing?
To be continued. It was too dark.
After all that time in between seasons, the beginning of season 4 did a fake-out cliffhanger, but the relatively short wait for the next episode made for good narrative momentum in uncovering its internal conspiracy, and early season 4 was rewarded with high ratings. So, a great function of a cliffhanger during a season's run is that it can create a kind of feedback loop with the audience. Since there's a period of build-up between the airing of new episodes, audience members have time to discuss the events of the series they were watching. Today, this can be done in person or on social media. Honestly, the potential for building anticipation through cliffhangers has likely never been higher. Outside of discussion and active watching, audience members who watch a television show and are connected to it will just naturally think about it, even when they're not actively consuming it. So it's interesting to think about how this relates to the more modern trend of full season release TV where binge watching is more encouraged. Because the practices associated with it removes the period of anticipation and discussion from the episode-to-episode routine altogether. By the time a cliffhanger can even begin to get processed, the next episode is almost ready to start, so the anticipation just gets kind of washed over. Binge watching and full season release TV just don't prioritize cliffhangers in the same way weekly release TV does. But that's not to say these are the only two formats available. To this day, release models are still being experimented with. Case in point. Arcane is in some pretty uncharted territory with its releases. Season 1 was split into 3 acts, meaning it had to build investment and hook audiences enough to continue watching twice. I think the end of episode 3 is great, it has a real end of prologue vibe, the characters and stakes are clear, easily understandable, and just as the setting is being fleshed out and the story is getting moving, the episode ends. It's smart to end on a tragedy with the knowledge in the audience's mind that there's more to come very soon. Hell, the characters practically say it.
We will show them all.
But how will they show them all? Oh, that's really good. However, I don't think the end of episode 6 nails it in the way episode 3 did. Like, at all. It technically does what the show does a lot of. Arcane's story and themes deal in a lot of symmetry and opposites. Vi and Jinx are separated at the end of episode 3, and they reunite for the first time at the end of episode 6 as changed people. Jinx begins to spiral when Caitlyn catches up with them, the firelights appear, get Vi and Caitlyn away from the battle, and Jinx is left alone for the second time, except in a much worse mental state. She screams and the episode ends, no! But it just feels a little flat. Like, the encounter ended, I've got a sense of where the story may be headed, but it cuts off so quickly with none of the gravitas of episode 3's ending. It doesn't really scream end of Act 2, it just screams. No! Like, thanks for coming, see you in a week. If you want to point to a part of the story that properly feels like an end to Act 2, though, it would be the battle on the bridge at the end of episode 7, right? After Echo is properly reintroduced as a member of the Firelights, after his hideout in a separate part of the Undercity is revealed, after Jace begins to truly struggle between his duties as a politician and as a scientist, and when it finally blows up in everyone's faces. Twice. I don't think there's anything overwhelmingly wrong with episode 6's ending, other than maybe direction, but unnecessary emphasis is placed on it as the end of the second act because the show has to be released in thirds for some reason. Episode 7's ending is just so much more effective as an end to the second act of the story because it concludes the sequence of Vi and Caitlyn going into the Undercity, properly casts doubt on Jace's ability to be a councilman after he becomes one at the beginning, and features climactic action that properly culminates in a fallout that sets up the finale. And that's not even mentioning stuff like Victor's increasing desperation. Problem is, there's only 2 episodes of the show left, so Act 2's ending is just kind of made to be awkward. To be fair, this is probably the lowest stakes act you could have ended poorly, so I'm glad it was this one, I guess. At this point, you could probably make a case that if you were invested in Act 1's ending, the narrative momentum, and greater intrigue in the post-time skip setting could weather an awkward ending for Act 2, and get you through the rest of the season regardless. I'm nitpicking a lot, but I wanted to lay out even the tiny grievances I have to accentuate how much I liked episode 9. And it's not just because some of the best and most memorable lines are in it. It isn't just because it features standout animation in a show full of already beautiful cuts, that it has arguably the best visual direction the series has to offer, or that it plays a Sting song. It's that the cliffhanger tied everything together and got me looking forward to season 2 practically immediately. Because just like Dallas, it took an already fraught scenario, dumped lighter fluid all over the place, struck a match, and walked out. It effectively does the who shot JR dilemma again. We don't know who in the council's meeting room is going to live, if anyone even did. And beyond that, what does the fallout and greater implications of this ending mean for the surviving characters and setting after you blow up the place that was about to vote for peace? That's for season 2. I think the end of episode 9 is a great cliffhanger and a very effective way to make any given audience member's personal investment shoot through the roof. But it's kind of hard to think of it as having made any kind of significant impact. To be clear, Arcane was very popular when it was coming out. It was such an immediate, ridiculous success that a second season was announced the day Act 3 was released. I'm also not comparing Arcane to Dallas in terms of scale. I didn't expect a French animator to be flown out to meet the Queen or something. Well, I guess they can't now, but when it comes to the conversation, amidst all of the praise I saw in discussion threads back in 2021, I also noticed a present feeling of sad resignation, or even annoyance that we would have to wait a while for another season. In addition to that, the cliffhanger was just not as overwhelmingly present in the conversation as it felt like it should have been. When it comes to the cliffhanger not taking as much precedence in the conversation, the release windows are the most obvious circumstantial difference. The space between Dallas Season 3's finale and Season 4's premiere was about 6 months, whereas the time between Arcane Season 1's finale and Season 2's premiere will be about 3 years. And it's just going to be incredibly difficult to maintain anticipation for that long of a time. Dallas Season 4 actually premiered 2 months later than originally intended because of the 1980 actors' strike, and interest was maintained thanks to reruns being aired during that time. The structure and release of the shows play a part too. Dallas wasn't a stranger to ending episodes on cliffhangers, but it was also a big fan of its one-offs. And when you're a soap opera with 25 episodes to a season, you've got more breathing room to establish character dynamics, and build up towards a big moment feels more like a slow burn than a race against time. That's on top of the fact that one-off episodes had been a well understood and loved practice within television's creation and consumption for at least 2 decades at that point. It was a normal and expected thing to do. Spacing all of that out over the span of half a year or so is going to make for a much less cluttered, more consistent watching experience. Obviously, full season releases are not the only way that TV is released nowadays, but it's certainly still around and has its fair share of detractors. As we've already covered, it can make the watching experience more uncomfortably dense, so Arcane seemingly ameliorates this problem by spacing its releases out in batches. But when you think about it, it really doesn't, because while Arcane spaced its releases out by a week between each group of episodes, it was still 3 episodes per release, which meant 3 times less the amount of room than something like Dallas's episodes had, meaning less overall time to think about and discuss the events of the season, regardless of how much more immediate and widespread discussion can actually be. Even if it's over the span of a couple of weeks, consuming Arcane in its release format is going to feel more like a blur than it would have if it released 1 episode per week instead of 3. This doesn't mean that Arcane is overwhelmingly complex or a difficult show to understand. It's just that there's more of it to take in at a time if watched in its release format. So the build-up to and impact of the cliffhanger may not have taken as much precedence in the audience's minds because there was just more stuff to think about. But I think there's something to be said about how this muddles the discussion period, too. In theory, there being more to take in at once and the gravity of the cliffhanger and its zooming out and teasing of the wider implications of the story could lead to higher audience investment in the moment. But if that was the intention, it's kind of betrayed by social media's shorter attention span when it comes to engaging with this sort of release format. I don't think this is because TV audiences across the board have become, I don't know, stupid or something, because I hear that sometimes. I think it's just that there is, again, so much more TV to immediately take in with this format, even if you're trying to split the difference with release. What might make for an effective cliffhanger during the watching experience becomes more muddled when discussion actually begins, because the conversation on all of the newly released stuff has to happen now. And I believe this comes with a higher chance of muddying the waters when it comes to how big of an impact the season-ending cliffhanger can actually make, because it's fighting for conversation space against everything else of significance. So many more things of significance than the weekly format allows. Twitter tags are infamously fickle unless you get hyper-specific. The search feature has gotten noticeably worse with time. The character limit per post is a pain in the ass. And with batch releases, conversation moves almost blindingly fast there. Discussion threads that group episodes together leads to much of the same problem with regards to important events getting drowned out in the scale of the dialogue. So you're torn between a cluttered viewing experience or a cluttered discussion afterwards, and honestly, it's probably some combination of both. Now, this is just sticking to how the audience processed the show. The issue gets more confusing when you take into account how companies evaluate the impact of these things. With streaming shows, it is, charitably, more difficult than it ought to be to grasp the impact of a series because the metrics related to that are largely confidential and tied to consistent uncertainty if anything can even be called a success when everything seems to get cancelled all the damn time. For the sake of scope, we're keeping things just to Netflix. Arcane thankfully had the benefit of being renewed immediately, but let's not let that distract us from the fact that the company's metrics for success are infamously shitty, and they seem to raise more questions than answers the more transparent they get. Arcane, like all Netflix shows, was measured in hours, not views. Kind of weird, considering that each episode is 35 to 45 minutes, but I think I get it. But last year, Netflix got a tiny bit more transparent and showed that they also champion variables like completion rate and unique viewers over the first 28 days. Which, if you bust out a calculator, creates weird contradictions in their own cancellation history and makes their priorities, what they deem a success, and the impact of any season of television nearly impossible to grasp. When you go down the rabbit hole on this stuff, it kind of disillusions you on TV streaming popularity as a concept. Like, Arcane was in the Netflix top 10 for a bunch of countries, that's great, right? But when you contrast it with cancellations that were there too, it just kind of makes you wonder what the point of having it is. Like, Cowboy Bebop was in the top 10. It gets worse if you bring in other studies to compare it to. Like, in the days after Act 3 was released, Deadline shared a report that claimed that Arcane apparently had 67.1 times the demand of the average TV show worldwide. What does that even mean? What is it being compared to? Does that mean people really liked the episode 9 cliffhanger? Are they just finishing the show? Or is that word of mouth doing its job over the course of the season's release? That's another thing. With social media, word of mouth is much more connected to how online everything is, which I think is a kind of interesting development, but with the gradual decline of cable, it puts more emphasis on word of mouth as advertising than network TV did, since on-demand television faced the commercial breakout of the experience. So is that demand? Who knows? So, combining all of that together, when it's difficult to grasp the social impact of a cliffhanger from a discussion and statistical perspective, and when you've already got a Season 2 confirmation anyway, what else is there to do but just settle into the wait between seasons? It's more than what many other shows get. This actually opens up the door to talk about how cliffhangers is marketing. Another utility of cliffhangers has kind of been eroded by the current media environment. So, when Dallas did its season-ending cliffhanger, the practice was mostly untested, but the explosion of hype that resulted from it wasn't just a social phenomenon, it was advertising for the series. When people were speculating on who shot JR, the name JR went around a lot. The sentence showing up in US politics is a perfect example of this. Dallas's Season 3 cliffhanger was used in the 1980 presidential campaign, but out of context, the name JR is not going to make any sense unless you know what Dallas is and why JR is relevant. Again, Dallas is one of the most extreme cases of this, but it's also a very clear example of how anticipation can be an effective form of marketing. Investment in the world of the story and something going unresolved isn't just a narrative technique, it's an ad. And there are two reasons why this cliffhangers as marketing approach doesn't really work anymore. One, the wider streaming environment just doesn't do cliffhangers many favors, especially if the show in question drops its full season at once, something that's been a trend for a long time now. Again, Arcane does technically try to sidestep this by spacing its batch releases out by a week, and it feels like it helps just as much with season completion rate, honestly. Despite my feelings on the execution, it's a decent idea if your goal is keeping engagement over the course of the show's run. But for the season-ending cliffhanger, it's still going to be a very long time in between seasons. And this basically industry-wide circumstance can be credited to a multitude of things: the accompanying density of the full season release model and anything close to it, COVID's impact on production times across the board, including animated shows like Arcane, the fact that many of these shows aren't given the space to think more than a season ahead, if they get to make more than one season at all. How do you market art when the streaming environment is defined by practices that are so anti-art? In place of something like the commercial break, you might see a trailer on social media a month out from release, and that trailer will probably get shared in an article, but outside of that, like what? A billboard? Second, and you probably already have some understanding of this, season-ending cliffhangers are more or less a completely saturated market. Wildly popular TV shows have used them, stuff that's more niche and went decades without a continuation have used them. At this point, Who Shot JR was directly parodied decades ago. So with a media environment as notoriously unstable as streaming, something like Arcane may have been incentivized to get as many people on side as soon as possible, even if that meant doing a season-ending cliffhanger on Season 1, because anticipation just isn't going to be as easy to drum up in this scenario, and the long production time most likely would have, perhaps inevitably, caused this ending to fade in the audience's memory as time went on. Better then to leave a number of plot threads unresolved and end the first season on a cliffhanger, which is probably where some of the annoyance I saw in those discussion threads comes from. Forget the idea of using the cliffhanger as an advertisement, maybe it's just to get the audience invested at all. No matter how good you are, doing a cliffhanger ending in a medium full of them, in a streaming environment influenced by full season releases, long hiatuses, and potentially muddled audience discussion, is going to make it an almost impossible task to make an impact that maintains relevance until you pop up again. So, is it a losing game? Are season-ending cliffhangers just not super viable anymore? Well, they're definitely in a more precarious position now, and their erosion is one of the many reasons you could reasonably interpret the streaming age to be a massive failure. So, until the streaming bubble bursts, maybe. I don't know. Let me take a little bit longer on this video and I'll tell you how that goes. Nussbaum brings up an interesting point about the cliffhanger's origins, that they came from a time when novels were published in piecemeal, and relates that time with TV today. Or as today as the early 2010s can get, anyway. I know things have changed. That novels being published as full packages keeps the reader and audience at a distance that's perhaps a little more distinguished, connecting that change with a kind of legitimization of the novel as a more fittingly artistic medium. In a way, TV being released on streaming in the full season release or full season release adjacent format makes any given television show immediately less understandable, if for no other reason than there's just a lot of stuff to go through. But is it distinguished? I don't think so. Maybe in another decade it could seem that way, but as it stands, Season 1 of Arcane is great, released in a way that was weird and cumbersome, but ended strong and received great reviews and high streaming numbers. At best, it's a thrilling joyride, and at worst, it's a testament as to why TV shows aren't released this way, no matter how strong your cliffhanger ending is. I don't really think it leads TV in a more distinguished direction, if for no other reason than it sands down qualities of the medium that it spent decades iterating on. But it's important to not get rose-colored glasses for how things used to be too. Commercial breaks are largely phased out in the streaming age, but the marketing associated with them has its own dubiously ethical history. For as anti-art as the streaming media landscape is, what with shows struggling to get more than one season greenlit and all, it's important to note that Dallas, for all of its popularity and influence, also ran until the early 90s, and is generally considered to have gotten much worse as it continued. Unless you're a hardcore fan, you aren't really going to bring up the back half of the series in a discussion about great TV. I'm serious, look up what happened with season 9, it's amazing. I also don't want to imply that Arcane Season 1's Cliffhanger was a failure because it didn't rock the medium like a soap opera that aired 4 decades before it, and had aired like 40 more episodes when its bomb dropped. Arcane's season-ending Cliffhanger is excellent, it's just failed by the medium in its current form. But all the same, I think the way these cliffhangers were absorbed by their respective viewer bases is interesting, because they're both signs of how the medium is changing, not at all dissimilar to how Charles Dickens' stands popping off on a boardwalk in the 1800s was a sign of changing times for the novel. That's kind of what makes pop culture as a societal phenomenon so fascinating to me. Dallas has its space in dramatic soap opera history, as I'm sure Arcane will have its place among those who enjoy fantasy, steampunk, and sci-fi, if its conclusion really lands.
Are you fucking kidding me?
But I don't think it's irrelevant to point out that for as long as TV shows have been allowed to continue their productions, getting them to stand out has never, ever, ever been an easy task. But what's definitely gotten more difficult over time has been getting your audience engaged enough to even bother coming back. Hey, just between you and me, I am so sick of saying the word cliffhanger. I never want to say it again.
Fuck you, Cliffhanger.